Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners.
And welcome.
Thank you for listening.
I'm off to the Lewis and Clark Trail.
Yeah, you're excited.
My car's nearly packed. First I had to shovel it out. That took 3 or 4 hours.
And which RAI are you going to stop at?
Not this time. Every year I go and buy a new tent, and I think, well, how many do you really want, you know? I'm rehabilitating all my old gear, and I found it in the garage.
That's good.
I actually cleaned out my garage, and so now I could find the gear. I mean, my life is getting better in almost every way.
What's coming over you, man?
Well, my daughter's going to Oxford.
Yeah, I heard that in the show.
And, you know, that's not for the faint of heart. And we're going to have to make a few sacrifices to make this happen. And so
I'm going to make you vote for one of those student loan forgiveness candidates.
I'm with Elizabeth Warren now. She can't be inaugurated fast enough for me. She got to forgive it all. Retrospectively and prospectively.
Bernie does that too, doesn't he?
I'm 100% against a universal forgiveness of student loans. I can't go there.
But the idea of making higher education more affordable for people is a good
and giving people breaks on interest on student loans, maybe forgiving some of it. All I'm saying is that she's going to Oxford, and it's a kind of a family sacrifice, and I'm making my sacrifice. I have a rule, 24-hour, actually 48-hour waiting period before the urge to buy a book and the purchase of it, and read a book, buy a book. I'm eating down my freezers and you heard that, plural, freezers. I'm eating down my pantry. I turned off the television set. I'm not buying any big ticket items unless there's a compelling reason to do it. And you know what? I feel better and I feel good. I feel like I have a life of some minimal integrity for the first time in a long time. And now this trip, I'll be out there, and you realize, as Jefferson says, how few our real needs are. You're out there floating on the river. It doesn't matter whether your Tevas are 1 day old or 1 year. Because I'll tell you what, for like 7 years in a row, I bought new river shoes. Because you go buy them, they're great, they're beautiful, they're splendid, they're black. And then you go out there, and in 1 hour you get into the river, and they're muddy, and they're just shoes now. They've turned from new, expensive, aesthetically pleasing items to river shoes in 1 hour, and that's all you need to know. Because that's so true of almost everything, that newness, consumer newness in America is this like magnetic, charismatic energy in our lives. And I feel this when I go out for a really expensive meal, and then you eat it and you think, you know, if I'd had a taco, I would be just as happy as I now am. And Thoreau says, simplify, simplify.
Yeah.
And I am living a little more deliberately than I normally do, and I'm going to see this through. This will shock you. I have a 3-car garage. For the first time in 15 years, I can actually walk through it. Otherwise, I have to go shovel out to get to something, and frequently I just say, oh, the heck with it, and go buy a new one. So that means you get an awful lot of head shears and weed whackers and things like that. So we had that day, you know, that happens twice a year in Bismarck where you can put out a small cement mixer and they'll take it. You can put out an ancient refrigerator and they'll take it. You can put a small nuclear device on the curb.
We're
they'll take
talking
it.
Trash removal.
Yeah, the big trash removal day. And so this year
cleanup day. I think so.
When they came down my street, there were 3 men in this giant truck, and they had a bulldozer behind them. I broke their spirit. Their spirit sagged. And they cleaned all that up. And then now I have this pathway through my garage. And I was out there last night, and I thought, it's like that scene in Naked Gun where Leslie Nielsen says, oh, there's the missing evidence in the Jones case. He went to the electric chair. You know, that's how I feel. Like, oh, there's that important document. Oh, that's where I left that folio.
What you're saying is you're growing up.
I'm growing up, and it's way too late. But, you know, Thoreau says it's never too late to build some new habits. And I'm hoping that these will gel. And, I'm actually really proud of what I'm doing.
All kidding aside, good for you. All kidding aside,
you're like trust but verify. You're like Ronald Reagan, trust but verify.
Those of you who are going to write them, why don't you make the header as Clay's Garage, and we'll just
send
file
books
all
by
those.
all means. Whatever book you think Clay Jenkinson wants to read, send it. Come to the Jefferson Hour. I'll take it. It's not really about books. It's about buying books.
After this, I'm not even going to ask for people to support the show. I just hope they will. And let's go to the show. Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. Seated across from me now is the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, the man who portrays President Jefferson when he's here, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. Good to see you, sir.
You too, David. We're talking about spirituality and religion today, and I'm about to go meet my God out in the Missouri River country. When I want to be with God or the Creator or the great being or the great mystery, I go into the Badlands, broadly defined, into the broken country of the Western Great Plains or the Intermountain West, and it always works. I always find spiritual healing when I'm out there. And I mean no disrespect, but I find it less often in the congregational church that I go to from time to time here in North Dakota.
But we're talking about this because of last week's conversation. That was about, particularly about this letter that Jefferson responded to from Miles King.
Miles King, the former sea captain who had led a life of debauchery, who now was a Methodist evangelical preacher in Virginia and had a couple of dreams about Jefferson's jeopardy, how Jefferson was in danger of going to the dark place because he wasn't a proper evangelical Christian believer. And so he wrote this 8,000-word screed to Jefferson, telling him how concerned he was and urging Jefferson to think again about his religious skepticism.
And Jefferson wrote him back
a lovely letter.
Yeah, it really was. But it also put Mr. King in his place.
In a very gentle way. I mean, it would be hard for anyone to flare up offended by the letter that Jefferson wrote because it was so obviously graceful and kind. And Jefferson says at the beginning of his letter, basically, here's why I'm taking the time to write back to you who are meddling in my private life. He says, I duly received your letter, and I thank you for it because I believe it was written with kind intentions and a personal concern for my future happiness.
And to me, it's one of the things that divides people, religion. And Jefferson writes about that in no uncertain terms, how devastating the effect of religion can be on people. I think he got a lot of that from, I want to say, Thomas Paine. How destructive Christianity can be,
but how destructive religious controversy can be, because Jefferson realized this isn't about whether the metric system should be based upon the mile or the meter. This is salvation. This is what happens when we die. This is there a heaven? Is there an afterlife? This is why are we on earth? These are the fundamental questions that any human being has to wrestle with in the course of a life. We're unique amongst animals, or nearly so, in that we have an awareness of this and our death. And so humans inevitably have to think about this. One of the first questions my daughter asked me when she was 3 or 4 years old is, what happens when we die? And then you
really?
think, okay.
At 3 or 4?
Yeah, and then
wow.
Okay.
We're there already.
Where do we take this exactly? Because my view is death is the big sleep. It's no different from a squirrel being run over by a 4-wheel drive truck in the middle of the road. That's it. But that's not exactly what you say to a 3 or 4-year-old.
Back to this, to back up my statement about Jefferson and his worry about how Christianity could be so destructive. Actually, it comes from notes on the state of Virginia. And he writes, millions of innocent men, women, and children since the introduction of Christianity have been burned, tortured, fined, and imprisoned. What has been the effect of this coercion? To make one half of the world fools and the other half hypocrites, to support roguery and error all over the earth.
Now read that again.
Which part?
The whole thing.
Millions of innocent men, women, and children since the introduction of Christianity have been burned, tortured, fined, and imprisoned. What has been the effect of this coercion? To make one half of the world fools and the other half hypocrites, to support roguery and error all over the earth.
Yeah, I think of Giordano Bruno, one of my heroes, who was executed in Rome in 1603. And why was he executed? He was a former Dominican priest, and he believed in a multiplicity of worlds, that this was not the only world, that there were a lot of them probably, and that there was almost certainly life on other worlds. And he disbelieved that he had serious doubts that Jesus was the Christ, and some other more kind of Scientological views. But he was this man, this intellectual. He had one of the greatest memories of anyone who ever lived on earth. He developed this incredible mnemonic system which allowed him to state the Psalms in Greek backwards, things like that. I mean, it was just a
Really?
human prodigy. But
Who would know if they were right?
Well, there were theologians, and he said that to the Pope. He said to the Pope, "You want to hear a psalm backwards in Greek?" And the Pope said, "Sure, sure. I want that." No one's ever.
Yeah, it's a once in a lifetime.
No one's ever made that request, so he did it. But anyway, he's this astounding figure, and because he believed the things that he believed, he was arrested, systematically tortured, and just imagine what that means, systematically tortured over a period of years. And then in 1603, the year that Hamlet was produced in England, he was taken to a public square. Because he was jabbering the whole time, he wouldn't shut up. They actually drove spikes through his tongue in both directions. So they impaled his tongue with these metal skewers, like kebab skewers.
Yeah, I get it.
And they hauled him to this site, and they put him on a pile of wood, and they lit it and burned him to death. That's what Jefferson means. Uh-huh. Really, it's that important? It's that believing that there's a multiplicity of worlds is worth torturing and burning a man alive?
It's interesting, though. I mean, this is 1787, Notes on the State of Virginia. Really, that book paved the way for his reputation, did it not? I mean, that's
in both directions. It hurt him.
Yeah,
it hurt him. His strictures on the Virginia Constitution hurt him, and his strictures on slavery hurt him, and his strictures on religion hurt him.
He goes on in that paragraph to talk about sister states of Pennsylvania and New York. They've existed without an established religion, and it worked just fine. Which to some I'm sure was heresy as well.
Well, so this is beyond the time when people are being burned at the stake. Now they're just made unfit for office. They're basically disenfranchised, persecuted in other ways. But still, there was a great deal of anti-Catholic persecution at this time and a fair amount of anti-Muslim and so on and so forth. So Jefferson, like Thomas Paine and like James Madison, is a believer in a free marketplace of ideas. You can believe anything you want as long as it doesn't break out into crime. So if you want to believe there are 100 gods or no God, or that God is a woman, or that God is a Shiite, you're welcome to that as long as you don't commit crimes, as long as you don't steal my property, or as he puts it, pick my pocket or break my leg. It's nobody's business but your own. That's a very rare view. And people like John Adams looked at that, and they respected it because they understood the intellectual basis of it. And in theory, people like John Adams agreed, but they didn't in fact, because they thought, well, if you take religion out, and there's no state religion, and people aren't required to attend church, they aren't required to believe a doctrine, then what if it releases social pandemonium? What prevents us from being criminals and thugs and rapists and murderers and thieves if there's no religion to rein in what Hamilton called the lusts and passions of mankind? And these conservatives believed this. They were not bad men. They thought, wait a minute, it's never really been tried to have a secular society and to think that won't cause social problems.
Yeah, that's what you said. That it's never been tried to have a secular society, and I try to put myself in their mindset, and they were fighting for freedom, for liberty, and somewhere along the line, religion got added to that list of freedoms. a very novel idea for them. It must have been a very novel idea.
It was. So it came from two directions. From the intellectual left, people like Jefferson and Paine, it came from a simple reasoning it out that when we create a social compact, when we create a government, we give it the power to tax us, and we give it the power to send us to war, and we give it the power to have a foreign policy and so on. There's a whole list of enumerated powers in Article 1 of the Constitution. Well, one of the powers we don't give to government is the power to coordinate our religious sensibilities. And Jefferson says that's off limits. We can't give it to government. Government can never take it from us. If government tries to take it from us, it's despotic and tyrannical. If we give it to government, then we're not good citizens. We must guard jealously our religious freedom. And these things are off limits because they don't have anything to do with the social order. Things that the government can do are things that involve social coordination, trial by jury, your right to face your accuser in a court of law, the way we proportion taxation and representation. Those are things that we have allowed government to handle in trust on our behalf. But there are things that we cannot hand over to government, and one of those is religion. So that's one direction, David. That's the intellectual enlightenment side of it. From the other end, you have these like Scots-Irish Presbyterians who are out in Western Virginia, and they're being taxed for the Anglican Church. There's an official church in Virginia. It's the Episcopalian Church. And these people are taxed for that church even though they don't believe it. They're forced to go to church services, or they're fined or imprisoned. They have to have their children baptized under the Anglican dispensation. So these are people who are being imposed upon by a religious doctrine and church structure that they find offensive to their own sensibilities, and their view was nuts to that. This is taxation without representation. No one's taxing me for being a Baptist. They're taxing me for not being an Anglican, and so they said, we're not taking it. Somebody has to be our champion. And there were two champions of this in Virginia. One of them was James Madison, and the other was Thomas Jefferson, and that's what brought them into their friendship.
Very good, sir. We're going to take a short break, but we'll return to this conversation on Jefferson and religion in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. Welcome back, Mr. Jenkinson.
Glad to be here. My friend David Swenson, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
In the last segment, we were talking about Jefferson and some of the things he wrote in Notes on the State of Virginia, and you were explaining how all that sort of fit together.
How much trouble those statements got into.
But at the end of that section from Notes on the State of Virginia, he writes, and this is in reference to the states that have decided not to have a state-established religion. He says they have made the happy discovery that the way to silence religious disputes is to take no notice of them. Let us too give this experiment fair play and get rid, while we may, of those tyrannical laws. That's great.
I think that the secularization of America and the wall of separation between church and state have been one of the two or three greatest things about the American experiment. And think of the religions here. If you look at the yellow pages, although maybe there aren't yellow pages anymore, of any city, you will see hundreds of different denominations. If this were 1520, they'd be fighting wars. There'd be militias. They'd be attacking each other in the streets with knives and clubs. They'd be burning each other at the stake. There would be torture in every direction. There would be, in Calvin, Switzerland, in Geneva, there would be committees that come to your house and interview you to see if your doctrinal views are correct, and if they aren't, they would force you into kind of relocation camps to get your religion right. So all this has gone on. The history of Europe is exactly what Jefferson says in Notes on Virginia. And then suddenly in the United States, thanks to people like Jefferson, he certainly didn't do this alone, but he's the most important figure, this country said, well, wait a minute. Why not just let everyone believe whatever they want to believe? and they can go to the churches of their choice. If they don't like the church they're in, they can leave and get a little place in a strip mall on the edge of town and get some plastic chairs and see if they can build a congregation. And the country just decided, of all the things we're going to fight about, we're not going to fight about this. We're going to leave this to individuals. And it's worked out spectacularly. It's one of the greatest single achievements of the Enlightenment. It's one of the greatest single achievements of the United States of America and our Constitution, which, by the way, never mentions religion or God, except to say that there can't be religious tests for public office.
And yet, the times we live in, the populism that flourishes during our times, I have no doubt that there are certain Americans who would like it if we did have a state-established religion.
Tens of millions, I think. This
So you don't think I'm out of line saying
hasn't
that?
gone this direction yet. I think largely because the current president is indifferent to religious life. But
you don't think that that's out of line?
No, I don't. I think that the time is going to come.
There are those people who would like that. Yeah.
If the president is reelected, or a person from his sort of perspective is elected in the next 10 years, I think you'll see a move on this. Because Ronald Reagan famously said in a sophistical sort of way, "Who expelled God from the classroom?" And there has been this belief that if we could only get prayer back in school and prayer back at school graduation in front of ball games and on the courthouse lawn creches and the Ten Commandments and so on, that if we could only go back to that kind of Ozzie and Harriet mythology about what America once was, we would improve. Things would cheer up. People would be more decent.
That could never happen in America, though, could it?
Oh, yes, indeed.
How?
How could it not?
Well, it would have to be some sort of a constitutional amendment, would it not?
No, it's constitutional interpretation. So let me be really fair to the people on the evangelical right. They would say that the Constitution has been distorted by leftists and intellectuals and academics, that the Founding Fathers never intended to have separation of church and state, that this is something that secularists have imposed, that there are a series of court cases that they can point to where they could have gone either way, but they've been increasingly moving towards no prayer in school and no prayer at baccalaureate and no cross on public land and so on, and that these decisions are arbitrary, that they're extra-constitutional, and that they are in clear violation of at least the spiritual intentions of the Founding Fathers, who intended us to be a Judeo-Christian nation. I disagree with that. I disagree with that profoundly on a whole range of fronts. But they believe it, and there are millions who agree with them, and there are millions of people who think that guys like I have and people infinitely more powerful than I have distorted the truth because we're filthy atheists who hate this country and who want to deny the obvious that this is God's country and that we are God's chosen people. And David Barton, we've talked about before, the guy who's written these books about the Founding Fathers and Jefferson, he believes that. He believes that he's right about Jefferson, that Jefferson was really a Christian, and that everything we said in last week's program about Jefferson's deism and his anti-Trinitarianism and his disbelief in the miracles and so on is either a vast distortion of Jefferson taken wildly out of context, or it's actually a lie promulgated by filthy atheists. And that view is huge. And let me just say that when he published his last book, the book on Jefferson, which later had to be pulled by the publisher because it got such deep criticism from the Jefferson academic community that said, look, a fair fight's a fair fight, but you can't make stuff up. The publisher finally pulled the book because it was so erroneous in every way. And then guess what happened? David Barton went to the Republican National Convention and gave talks there saying that the atheists were trying to destroy America and that they were succeeding because they had found a way to persecute him and get his book removed from the shelves. And the Republicans who were there, not all of them, of course, the Republicans who were there were applauding and cheering, oh, this poor martyr who's been damaged and persecuted by the atheists of this country, when in fact he is demonstrably wrong about Jefferson. He could be right about other things, but he is wrong about Thomas Jefferson. And there was no one at the Republican National Convention that said, why are we giving this guy a forum to speak when anyone who spends 5 hours reading about the religious life of Jefferson couldn't possibly endorse his point of view.
Goodness, I've gotten you all worked up.
Yeah, because you know what? I don't mind a fair fight. Let me put it this way. Jefferson was a semi-quasi-atheist. He always kind of clung a little bit to the notion. At times he thought maybe there is an afterlife. At times he had a more generous view of Jesus. Maybe in some sense he was divine. Jefferson was never absolutist about these questions, and he wrestled with them, and he was not 100% certain, but he was not a typical nominal Christian, and to play to cheat in the great debate for the truth is unacceptable. That's the very essence of the problem that we're in now, where someone like Kellyanne Conway can say, well, there are alternative facts. There are alternative truths.
I found a quote in reading up for this show that I don't know if it's my favorite quote of Jefferson's on religion, but it's got to be right up there. And I was going to read it and then hope you would unpack it for me. It's from an 1820 letter to his close friend William Short.
His protege.
He writes, "It is not to be understood that I am with him, Jesus, in all his doctrines. I am a materialist. He takes the side of spiritualism. He preaches the efficacy of repentance towards forgiveness of sin. I require a counterpose of good works to redeem it." I love that. In other words, show me. Show me
your behavior.
Don't just say, yeah, I'm sorry. Show me. Do something. Work at it. That's the way I get it anyway.
Yes, recompense. Let me go back to this letter to Miles King of September 26, 1814. I want to read the last passage of it, which I think is so incredibly important, and it goes right to what you've just been saying, David. He said, "I must ever believe that religion substantially good, which produces an honest life, and we have been authorized by one whom you and I equally respect to judge the tree by its fruit. Our particular principles of religion are the subject of accountability to our God alone. I inquire after no man's, and trouble none with mine, nor is it given to us in this life to know whether yours or mine, our friends or our foes, are exactly the right. Nay, we have heard it said listen to this. Nay, we have heard it said that there is not a Quaker or a Baptist, a Presbyterian or an Episcopalian, a Catholic or a Protestant in heaven, that on entering that gate we leave those badges of schism behind and find ourselves united in those principles only in which God has united us all. Let us not be uneasy, then, about the different roads we may pursue, as believing them the shortest to that our last abode, but following the guidance of a good conscience, let us be happy in the hope that by these different paths we shall all meet in the end, and that you and I may meet there and embrace, is my earnest prayer, and with this assurance I salute you with brotherly esteem and respect, Thomas Jefferson." That's about as good as it ever gets. There is not a Quaker or a Baptist or a Presbyterian or Episcopalian, a Catholic or a Protestant in heaven. I know off the top of my head at least a dozen people who would say that's just not true. That is not true.
Again, back to Notes on Religion. This was published in the works of Thomas Jefferson.
Notes on Virginia?
No, Notes on Religion.
Notes on Religion.
October 1776.
Okay.
Compulsion in religion is distinguished peculiarly from compulsion in every other thing. I may grow rich by art, but I am compelled to follow. I may recover health by medicines. I am compelled to take against my own judgment. But I cannot be saved by a worship I disbelieve and abhor.
Jefferson says in another context that if you put a gun to my head, you can make me attend Lutheran chapel, but that gun can't make me a Lutheran. So you can make me a hypocrite, but you can't make me a believer in Lutheran doctrine.
He had some strong written in stone beliefs that you would never change, but it was all based around freedom of choice and no imposition of religion.
So let's say that he meets person X, and that person is a devout Catholic, and the person is going on about the real presence and the Mass, and Jefferson's listening politely. He may ask some questions, but it doesn't bother Jefferson. He feels no he's not like the village atheist who now wants to take this person on. Jefferson's fine. This is absolutely good. We have no quarrel. But then if the person says, I'm worried about you, have you accepted Jesus as your personal Savior? Now Jefferson's going to get edgy, and he's going to pull back, and he's going to say, it's fine for you to believe whatever you believe. I don't in any way dispute that. I would prefer that you allow me to adjust my own religious convictions in my own way. And then if the person said, I condemn you as a sinner and as a person wholly unfit for the presidency of the United States because you're a filthy atheist, now Jefferson's going to say, this conversation is over. We have nothing further to say to each other. Let us hope we can disagree as rational friends. In other words, Jefferson is, my sister was the village atheist. I hate the village atheist, the person who in every situation tries to undo other people's belief and wants to wear their atheism on their sleeve. And she can be whatever she wants. I respect that. But you don't go to somebody who is a Methodist or a Lutheran or a Catholic and try to undermine their religious sensibilities as long as they're leaving you alone. Now, if they're hectoring you and coming by every night with literature and interrupting your dinner, that's one thing. But if they just happen to believe these things, it neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. And she would go after people with a kind of zeal. And then when they would limp away, she would be in triumph. She'd be like, look what I showed him. Wow, how can anyone believe this stuff? And you think, what's wrong with you? This is too private and too precious for you to be kicking around.
We talked about Jefferson as being kind of radical in his religious beliefs.
He was.
Well, yeah, but he wasn't on the edge like,
Always gracious.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of like Thomas Paine.
Well, when he wrote the 2-volume Age of Reason, it exploded his life. It absolutely destroyed him. People that loved him up till that point broke with him and could never think of him well again. And I was just talking about this on an interview yesterday. When Paine somehow escaped execution by the French Revolution, and he barely escaped, Jefferson wrote him a letter, said, I will send a public boat to get you, a packet, because you're an American hero and a martyr to freedom of conscience. And Paine said, "No, that's fine. I'm going to take a commercial vessel." So he got back to the New World, and Jefferson said, "Well, come live with me. Come stay in the White House for a while before you get settled." And so he did. Paine spent about a month with Jefferson,
right.
and that cost Jefferson more than almost anything that he ever did. He was denounced as a man who was housing this filthy atheist. Well, Paine was not an atheist. Paine was a deist, But people turned on him because he wrote that book. And so his views, if you actually distilled them, if you took his book and then distilled out the actual criticisms he had of Christianity, they would be almost identical to Jefferson's. The difference is a graceful presentation by Jefferson and a direct and graceless presentation by Paine.
And then there's Priestley's book, Corruptions of Christianity, which we know Jefferson read because he wrote to Adams and told him he had. It's like a 2-volume.
Jefferson loved it. He said he didn't go far enough. And then that's when
Really?
Priestley and others said, all right, let's see it. And then that led to the Jefferson Bible, which was Jefferson's very, very private attempt to construct the historical Jesus. And what
It almost feels like we should talk about that, but we devoted episodes in the past. We could certainly revisit it.
Well, let me say this about the Jefferson Bible, which he never called by that name, by the way, and he never published. The minute Jefferson did it, he did it over the course of about a week with a razor blade and 2 identical copies of the New Testament. And he put together this pamphlet, this scrapbook of the biographical details of Jesus and what he called his authentic sayings. The minute Jefferson did that, he began to regret it. This is in an age before anything could leak out.
He regretted cutting up the...
He regretted admitting that he had done it.
Oh.
He didn't regret doing it.
I didn't know
but
that.
He did not want anyone to know this. He didn't even tell his family. It was discovered in his papers after his death. He then, like when John Adams said, "I've heard that you're doing this thing. I'm very interested." Jefferson is evasive in his usual Jeffersonian way, but finally Adams pins him down and says, "Come on, I want to see this thing." And Jefferson then says, "Okay, here's the deal. I'm going to send it to you, but you have to read it and never show it to anybody.
Right.
You can't make copies of it. You can't distribute it. You can't say that you read it.
Knowing full well that he would, right?
But he knew that John Adams was basically discreet and responsible. But that Jefferson, I mean, the minute this was finished, he thought, oh, this is going to get me in so much trouble. This could get me in so much trouble.
And it did.
It did.
Yeah. Huh. Reading from Wikipedia, which, by the way, I donated to today, he was sympathetic to and in general agreement with the moral precepts of Christianity. He considered the teachings of Jesus as having the most sublime and benevolent code of morals which has ever been offered to man. Yet he held that the pure teachings of Jesus appeared to have been appropriated by some of Jesus' earlier followers, resulting in a Bible that contained both diamonds of wisdom and the dung of ancient political agendas.
He said it's as easy to find the pure sayings of Jesus in the New Testament as it is to pick out diamonds from a dunghill. Well, nobody really thinks that anymore. There are whole committees that have spent decades trying to figure out what's authentic and what's not. But here was Jefferson's criteria. He said, some of this is interpolation that came later by bad transmission of the texts. Some of this is sort of the politics of Christianity by, John's view is different from Matthew's view, is different from Luke's view, is different from Paul's view. And so he said, if you got to clear all that out. These are not objective. These are people that have a perspective and they have an axe to grind. And so we have to get that corrective lens up there to get real Jesus out of it.
We need to take a short break, but we'll return to this conversation in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, out of character this week, sitting across from my good friend David Swenson, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. David.
Yes, sir.
We talked about religion today in a whole range of ways.
Yeah, it's one of those subjects that you usually get a lot of firm opinions on. There's a couple that are hot-button issues. We're still sort of recovering from Baked In. That got a lot of mail.
What was the kind of mail?
Well, it was all sorts of stuff. There was a couple, I should have names so I could quote them, but there was one gentleman who just thought it was perfect and he really enjoyed it. And there were other people who said, you knucklehead, what's the matter with you? Okay? Get that? Don't talk about current events, talk about Jefferson. Well, sometimes we do both.
Well, I thought that program was really about Baked In. It wasn't so much about the situation. It was about how people are determined to believe what they believe and not much changes their mind on either front.
The other ones we always get a lot, religion, that Second Amendment, and our current president. There are a lot of people who just don't want you to talk about him.
Well,
they don't
too
want
bad.
to hear about it.
Too bad. I've been at this for 30 years. So that includes, I gave a talk before Congress during the Reagan administration. Lynn Cheney, the director of the National Endowment for the Humanities, she gave me the National Humanities Medal, and I have met G.W. Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, Bill Clinton, and Hillary Clinton on a number of occasions, Barack Obama. I performed before Supreme Court justices and so on. But here's my point. Of all the presidents of my lifetime, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and so on, some I like better than others. It's nonpartisan. I like some Republicans better than I like some Democrats, and vice versa. What I believe in is the rule of law, decorum, presidential comportment, representing the whole country, not some fragment of it, believing in the Constitution and being willing to abide by the separation of powers doctrine and so on. And I have to say that this president violates nearly everything that I believe is important in this country. And if you're afraid to say that, you shouldn't do this. And if people don't like it, they shouldn't listen, because this is not the Theodore Roosevelt hour. This is not the James Buchanan hour. This is not the Harry Truman hour. This is the Thomas Jefferson hour. This graceful, humane, incredibly decorous, elegant president who said, we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists, This is Jefferson. If you don't believe that, you need to do some reading.
Well, he would find a few things, but let me go back to your point about we are all Republicans. That was his first inaugural address.
Yes, and he shocked the world when he said it.
But he recognized that there's a difference between politics and governance. When you govern, there is no room for politics. We can disagree with people's policies, and that doesn't mean that we are mortal enemies. And we can say, well, I just don't think that tax policy is right, or I don't think this trade policy is right, and we can talk about it rationally.
Well, in policy, there might be a good deal that Jefferson would admire in President Trump. First of all, shaking up the establishment. I like a little rebellion now and then, so Jefferson's not necessarily against that. Attending to the swollen bureaucracy. Jefferson worried a great deal about swollen bureaucracies. Jefferson is an America firster. He's an internationalist and a cosmopolitan, but his view was our duty is to protect the sovereignty and the success of the American experiment, and the less we meddle in the madness of the rest of the world, the better. Jefferson's a free trader. But he realized that when we were being exploited by Britain, that we had to fight back. There had to be a mercantilist response to unfair trade practices. If you go through all of this, deregulation, Jefferson is a deregulator. So you could find, if you distilled Trump's policies into something that we could put on a rational piece of paper and forget tweets, Jefferson might well support a fair amount of what this administration stands for.
I guess what I'm trying to say is when you are so critical of the current president, it's not really based on policies, it's based on his personal behavior more than it is policies. Is that fair to say?
But it's contempt for institutions.
Yeah, well, the one that caught me is rule of law, because there's a lot of that going around right now where congressional orders are just being ignored because they don't think they're fair. That frightens me. I don't like seeing that.
The separation of powers doctrine is very important. Each branch needs to resist the others in certain ways. That's part of it.
There's a little friction expected.
Jefferson invoked executive privilege in the Burr trial. These are not simple civics classroom kind of things. They're complex, and we have a lot of bleed over in our system. My point is simple, that of all the presidents of my lifetime, I've had doubts about some, both Democrats and Republicans. This is the first time in my life I've thought this man is a danger to the constitutional order of the United States, and he has violated the fundamental principle that the president should try to rise above party and embrace the whole country. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. And that really bothers me. And if people don't like it, they can condemn me and say that I'm a fool. They can turn elsewhere. There's a lot of other media to listen to. They can write letters, and we can try to hammer it out with civil discourse. But I'm not going to be able to pretend that this is an okay person. I just can't.
The thing that worries me is, and you hear this a lot about the frog in boiling water. Put a pot of water on, put a frog in, and they don't really notice anything until it gets so hot it's too late. That frightens me, what we accept as a norm. But can we move on from
Of course.
Religion?
Of course.
Current politics?
Of course.
You have a trip coming up.
Yes. So
you do.
I get to go.
Are you all packed? Did you any extra cameras, new shoes, any of that kind of stuff?
I'm on this new lifestyle.
Oh yeah, no TV.
No
right?
TV, and I've been trying not to.
Reading a lot?
This is almost going to kill me. I have a mandatory 48-hour waiting period before my desire to buy a book and my push send on Amazon. So for the past 10 years.
How did that start?
I'm sending my daughter to Oxford. Send money, everyone. I'm sending my daughter to Oxford in the fall, and I decided, you know what? I'm going to have two principles. Because normally I just buy whatever book I want. And my house is just bulging.
How Jeffersonian of you.
But it's so stupid. And so I have this new principle, 48 hours. So if you mentioned a book right now, you should read He Leadeth Us, which someone mentioned to me last night at dinner. I will go look at it, and then I will put it in my little queue. And then if 48 hours later I still want it, I'll push send. That's rule number one. Rule number two.
All right, we have to make this sort of a regular check.
Yes.
In weeks to
come.
You
have doubts, do you?
You're still doing that, are you?
It's been 6 weeks.
Well, that's pretty good.
Since my daughter told me she's going to Oxford. That's when I went out and bought a case of ramen. The second rule is, this is harder, read a book, buy a book. So when I read a book, I'm empowered to buy a book. But you got to read a book to buy a book.
Well, now, let's just say, for instance,
And
that
in other words, I didn't buy a lot of gear because I'm on this diet.
somebody, what if somebody gifts you a book? How does that
Send me
work?
books. Send me thousands of
No,
books.
no.
If I mention
How does
a book,
that work?
send it. No, of course. It's not about books. It's about begging people to buy them for me. No, I mean, the people can send me anything. Please do. But no, so I didn't buy gear. I told my handler, Nancy, for the first time, I'm not stopping at REI and buying a bunch of new gear. I'm using the gear that I have.
I don't know how to feel about this. It's a little bit.
It's a little
It's kind of
sad,
like
isn't it?
the fun leaving Clay Jenkinson.
Oh,
We'll talk when you get back.
It's only leaving. No, well, first of all, every year or two, I give these seminars at Locksaw Lodge on Thoreau's Walden, and people love them. And I'm saying simplify, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And then
So now you're going to do it.
and then they kind of look at me like, well, preacher, heal thyself. And so now I'm doing it, and it's made a huge difference in my life.
Well, we'll keep checking in on that.
And
Meanwhile,
I don't really admire your skepticism, but that's all right.
I'm not.
You're like, we'll be checking up on you. That's all right. I can live with it. But
That's my position as your kind of foil here. I've got to do that.
anyway,
So-
I can't wait to get on my trip. It's the best week of my year, and there are other great weeks in my year.
And the subject of your essay this week, if I understand you correctly.
That is right, sir.
And, sir, it is time to end our conversation and move to this essay.
Here comes my favorite week of the year. It's the 18th time I head to Montana and Idaho for the Lewis and Clark Cultural Tour through the White Cliffs of the Missouri River east of Fort Benton and up on the Lolo Trail west of Missoula. I made a list yesterday of the number of times on that 9-day journey that you are assuredly, without doubt, actually in the footsteps of Lewis and Clark. We sleep in 4 authenticated campsites where they were 215 years ago, hike heroically up the Wendover Trail, 8 miles straight up, precisely as they did in September 1805, though we carry only camelbacks and electrolytes, while the outfitter and the internal combustion engine go by another path, doing the heavy lifting. We visit at least half a dozen places on the trail: the Sinkhole, Lonesome Cove, the Smoking Place, Spirit Revival Ridge, that correspond precisely to descriptions in the journals. No other Lewis and Clark trip puts you there in this way. My close friend Chad Jones, a.k.a. the Tree Dork, says that only perhaps 1,500 people have ever been stupid enough to attempt the Wendover Death March. And then he looks over at me and says, and a few truly demented people have done it more than once. But if you want to get into Lewis and Clark's footsteps, Chad says, this is precisely how you do it. But that, in some ways, is the least of it. I'm happy to talk Lewis and Clark until the cows come home, as they say. I'd talk about the expedition forever. After 30 years of thinking about the mercurial genius Meriwether Lewis, I still don't know why he put a gun to his head on October 11, 1809, at a squalid Airbnb 72 miles from Nashville on the Natchez Trace at the age of 35. Until I can make sense of that, I'm not going to stop puzzling over the journals, which, astoundingly, have never really been read closely in their entirety as literary texts as well as a historical narrative. I talk about the expedition on this annual cultural tour until I see their eyes glaze over, until someone tries to put himself on a gin drip. But mostly, we just drink in the American outback. To be out there on a late July day under the pines, beer or wine in hand and the smell of steak or salmon on the grill, sitting in fabric lawn chairs in nearly inaccessible mountains, replacing uptightness with relaxation and replacing shallow breathing with a deep return to our bodies after months of treating them like head delivery systems, watching the first stars blink on and feeling the cool of the evening sashay through the campsite. That is more or less paradise on earth. Chad does comic shtick with his Chevy Chase arrow through the head routine, picks up milk duds, which he calls indeterminate wilderness scat, and plucks them into his mouth, or his famous crayon-painted paper mask, which he calls sack a jawea, until I banish him to his tent for the sake of accurate history and tell him, as he slinks away, like Steve Martin's Freddy in Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, that we all hope he will pass his GED exam this time. And then there is the river. The Missouri is a manageable and hospitable river through the White Cliffs. It's 85 degrees and 10% humidity, if that, on a July afternoon, and you're in a canoe drifting down what Meriwether Lewis called the mighty and heretofore deemed endless Missouri. When you get to camp somewhere around 4 p.m., hors d'oeuvres will be waiting and bracingly cold beer. Your tent has been set up with a personalized ID label, and they're already chopping up vegetables for dinner. A wood nymph named Heather darts through the camp carrying more weight than you could after a year in a gym, and you think, I would give anything to be that healthy if it didn't require any human effort. Drifting down the river in the afternoon, gazing up at the blue sky, slipping past golden eagles as if they were sparrows or wrens, examining the famous white cliffs that Lewis said had the feeling of scenes of visionary enchantment, and at times just pulling the paddles into the canoe to feel the gentle but inexorable tug of the continent. This, too, is paradise on earth. It's not a frightening river. Were there no current, you could walk across it in most places. The water temperature is perfect, except at dawn you could stay in the river for hours without getting chilled. At some point in those afternoons, you forget about your civilizational woes, health insurance, tuition payments, handling your aging parents' needs, the current political madness of America. And for a few minutes, or perhaps an hour, you drift into a magic state called presence, or pure being. You just are. Your mind and your heart are clear. You are in one of the most beautiful places in North America. All your needs are being met, and as Jefferson says in southern France, it is amazing how few and how simple our real needs are. You are no longer an ego or even an identity. You may not be one with the river, the cliffs, the eagles, the sky, and the cosmos, but you are as close as you are going to get to being one with the cosmos without yoga or dangerous drugs. When this happens, I think, thank God I'm an American. I so love this country. Whatever else is wrong with it, and the beat goes on and on and on, we have places like this that have been set aside by an enlightened national government so that generations of Americans can have this experience without jet skis or burrito food trucks or obnoxious people with fireworks. It is as close to Huck Finn as you're ever going to get, and you are not escaping from anyone or anything, and there are no moral dilemmas except that you left your lip balm at the last campsite. Our lives have many goals. One of them is to be present with a capital P. As you know, it is almost impossible to be present ever or for very long. We need to take it when we get it, and if you cannot get it on day 2 of the Lewis and Clark canoe trip, you probably can't get it anywhere. It is so deeply satisfying to just be. Walt Whitman wrote, I think I could turn and live with the animals. They are so placid and self-contained. I stand and look at them long and long. They do not sweat and whine about their condition. They do not lie awake in the dark and weep for their sins. They do not make me sick discussing their duty to God. Not one is dissatisfied. Not one is demented with mania of owning things. Not one kneels to another, nor to his kind that lived thousands of years ago. Not one is respectable or unhappy over the whole earth. For a few hours every July, that is what my life becomes. I make the same 2 resolutions after every summer Lewis and Clark cultural tour. First, note to self, nothing in the world could ever make me hike up the Wendover Death March again. 2, I'm going to do this trip, including the Wendover Death March, every year until I collapse on the trail and they give me burial at sea somewhere near Cathedral Rock on the mighty and heretofore deemed endless Missouri River. I will report back in 2 weeks. Chad likes to jump me in camp like Kato in the Pink Panther movies. My jiu-jitsu moves are not as sharp as they once were. Wish me luck. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.